a grief-hollowed lumberjack, Elias, offered shelter to a young woman, Lily, abandoned by her own heartless parents at a desolate frontier trading post, entirely unaware that she carried within her the quiet, budding miracle he had despaired of ever knowing, a future he had long since prayed for and then forgotten. The wind, a mournful voice across the high peaks, was Elias's most constant companion, its song echoing the hollow chambers of his heart, a space once filled with the warmth of his Sarah, now cold as the iron stove before dawn. He moved through the tall pines like a shadow himself, his axe falling with a rhythm born of solitude and sorrow, each strike a punctuation mark in a life sentence of remembrance. His cabin, nestled deep within the indifferent embrace of the mountains, was a testament to his skill and his isolation, its sturdy timbers weathered to the silver grey of old grief, smoke a thin, lonely ribbon against the vast, bruised sky. Years had passed since Sarah's laughter had danced in the sparse rooms, since her touch had gentled the rough edges of his world. He'd prayed then, in the raw agony of her absence, prayed for a sign, for a reason, for a whisper of life to return, but the heavens had remained stubbornly silent, and his prayers, like autumn leaves, had scattered and been buried under the snows of ensuing winters. Now, he prayed no more. He worked, he endured, he existed. The forest was his unyielding sanctuary, its silence preferable to the clamor of settlements, its stark beauty a reflection of his own stripped-bare soul. Autumn was bleeding into the land, the aspens turning to coins of trembling gold, a final, fleeting richness before the long white fast of winter. Elias needed supplies, salt and flour, perhaps a new whetstone for his axe. The journey to Coulter's Dell, the nearest smudge of civilization, was a 2-day trek, a necessary evil he postponed until the bite in the air warned him procrastination was a luxury he could no longer afford. He packed his mule, his movements economical, his face a mask carved from impassive stone, revealing nothing of the faint dread that always accompanied these forays into the world of men, a world that had given him much, and then taken everything. The pines watched him go, their ancient branches sighing, as if they knew the pattern of his life was about to be irrevocably altered by a fragile whisper of humanity he was yet to encounter. Coulter's Dell clung to the edge of a muddy river, a motley collection of rough-hewn buildings that smelled of damp wool, cheap whiskey, and desperation. Trappers, traders, and those simply lost or running from something, congregated here, their voices loud, their eyes wary. Elias, taller than most, quieter than all, moved through them like a stone in a rushing stream, his purpose singular. He bartered his carefully stacked pelts at the trading post, his words few, his gaze direct. It was as he was strapping the sacks of flour onto his mule that he saw them, a grim tableau near the frost-hardened ruts of the main track. A man, florid-faced and loud, gestured angrily. A woman, thin-lipped and weary, wrung her hands. Between them, a girl, hardly more than a child, stood with her head bowed, a small, pathetic bundle clutched in her hands. She was a reed in a bitter wind, swaying but not breaking, though the force of their words seemed to physically buffet her. Elias heard snippets. Useless, burden someone else's problem now. The girl, Lily, as he would later learn her name, never looked up, her silence a stark contrast to their harsh recriminations. Her parents, for such they were, seemed determined to rid themselves of her, their faces pinched with a mixture of resentment and grim relief. The trader, a man Elias knew to have a heart as cold and hard as a winter river stone, watched with a calculating gleam, perhaps weighing her worth as an indentured servant, a scullery drudge. Elias felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a ghost of the protective rage he'd once felt for Sarah. This girl, with her downcast eyes and the tremor in her slender shoulders, was an outcast, deemed lesser, a piece of unwanted baggage. He saw not what they proclaimed her to be, but a vulnerability that resonated with the deep, scarred places within him. He thought of the empty space in his cabin, the silence that was sometimes a comfort, sometimes a torment. Without conscious thought, the words formed, rough and unpracticed. He stepped forward, his shadow falling over the tense group. The loud man turned, scowling. "What do you want, mountain man?" Elias looked past him, at the girl. His voice, when it came, was like the scrape of rock on rock. "She can come with me." A stunned silence fell. The parents exchanged incredulous glances. The trader raised a curious eyebrow. It was not an offer of purchase, not a transaction. It was a statement, simple, declarative, and in its starkness, an act of profound, unlooked-for mercy. The journey back to the high peaks was swathed in an almost unbroken silence, a silence different from the one Elias usually courted. This quiet was taut with unspoken anxieties, with the delicate, uncertain presence of another human being sharing his path. Lily walked beside the mule, her small, worn boots making little sound on the pine-needle-strewn trail. She had not uttered a single word since leaving Coulter's Dell, her face pale and drawn, her eyes, when she risked a fleeting glance towards him, wide and skittish like a cornered fawn's. Elias, unaccustomed to such fragile company, found himself clumsy in his attempts at consideration, offering her a piece of jerky which she accepted with a barely perceptible nod, her fingers, small and chilled, brushing his own calloused hand for a fleeting instant. He felt an unfamiliar tremor at the contact, a sensation so long absent he had almost forgotten its nature. He cleared his throat, a rough sound in the crisp air, and pointed towards a distant ridge. "Cabin." Soon she nodded again, her gaze fixed on the ground ahead, her small bundle held tight against her chest as if it contained all the remnants of her shattered world. The cabin, when they finally reached it as dusk painted the western sky in hues of bruised purple and dying ember, seemed even starker and more isolated than usual, seen through the imagined filter of her eyes. He unlatched the heavy wooden door, the scent of cold wood smoke and old solitude greeting them. He gestured her inside. Warmth. Food inside, the single room was sparsely furnished, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, his bunk, a stone hearth where embers still glowed faintly. It was a man's space, utilitarian, devoid of softness. Lily hovered near the doorway, a wraith in the gathering gloom, until he coaxed the fire back to life, its flickering orange light chasing some of the shadows into the corners. He busied himself with preparing a simple meal, a stew of dried meat and hoarded vegetables, the familiar routine a comfort to his own disquiet. He was acutely aware of her presence, of her stillness, of the subtle scent of fear and wood smoke that clung to her thin clothes. He did not press her for conversation, sensing that words were a currency she either did not possess or was unwilling to spend. He placed a bowl of stew on the table, a piece of bread beside it. Each she approached slowly, hesitantly, and sat, her movements fluid and ghost-like. She ate with a delicate, bird-like precision, her eyes downcast. Elias ate his own meal standing by the hearth, watching the snow begin to fall outside the single small window, soft, silent flakes that promised a deep blanketing of the world, a further layer of isolation. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the faint click of Lily's spoon against the wooden bowl. It was a beginning, though what it heralded, neither of them could yet fathom. Days bled into weeks, measured by the deepening snowdrifts outside and the slow, almost imperceptible thaw in the atmosphere within the small cabin. Lily remained largely silent, a quiet wraith flitting through the corners of Elias's solitary existence. He gave her space, an almost reverent distance, understanding that trust, like a wild bird, could not be forced, only patiently invited. He would leave for his day's work felling timber, and upon his return, he would find the cabin subtly changed. The dirt floor, always swept, seemed more meticulously so. His few tin plates and cups gleamed. A tear in his old wolfskin coat, one he'd ignored for months, was neatly stitched, the thread fine, the stitches almost invisible. These were her first words, spoken not with her voice but with her hands, small acts of care that resonated deeply in the quiet man's soul. He, in turn, left offerings, a thicker blanket for the pallet he'd made for her near the hearth, a pair of his discarded woolen socks, much too large but warm, a piece of dried apple left on the table. He noticed she favored the side of the cabin with the small window, often gazing out at the snow-laden pines, her expression unreadable. One afternoon, he returned to find her humming, a low, melodic sound, almost like the wind sighing through the high branches, as she mended one of his shirts. The sound startled him, so unaccustomed was he to any music save the forest's own. It was a fragile melody, tinged with an old sorrow, yet undeniably beautiful. It stopped the moment she sensed his presence, her head ducking, her hand stilling. He said nothing, simply hung his axe by the door, but a knot inside him, one he hadn't realized was so tightly bound, eased a fraction. He began to see past the fear in her eyes, to glimpse the resilience beneath. She was like a winter sapling, bowed by the storm but with life stubbornly clinging to its core. He found himself thinking of Sarah more often, not with the sharp pang of fresh grief, but with a softer, more wistful remembrance. Sarah had loved the first snowdrops, the stubborn bloom of life in a harsh world. He saw a similar quiet strength in Lily, a tenacious hold on some inner light. The forest itself seemed to respond to her gentle presence. A shy snowshoe hare once peered in through the open door, lingering longer than usual, its gaze fixed on her still form. Elias watched, a strange warmth spreading through him, a feeling akin to hope, though he dared not name it. The contours of winter softened almost imperceptibly, the days lengthening by minutes, the sun gaining a sliver more strength. And with this subtle shift in the season, another change became apparent, one Lily could no longer conceal beneath the folds of her worn dress and the heavy cloak Elias had given her. Her belly, once flat, now held a gentle, unmistakable swell. Elias had noticed its slow rounding, had seen the way she sometimes rested a protective hand upon it when she thought he wasn't looking. He had said nothing, his mind a turmoil of unasked questions and a burgeoning, unexpected tenderness. He was a man of the mountains, familiar with the cycles of life in the wild, the undeniable urge of nature to propagate. Yet, this human manifestation, in this silent, lost girl he had taken in, stirred something profound and unsettling within him. He thought of his own barren years with Sarah, the quiet ache of a cradle never rocked, of lullabies unsung. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was the reason for her abandonment, that burden her parents had been so desperate to shed. One evening, as the fire cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, and the wind moaned a mournful lullaby around the eaves, he finally broke the unspoken. He had been sharpening his axe, the rhythmic rasp of stone on steel a familiar counterpoint to the cabin silence. Lily sat by the hearth, her hands clasped over her abdomen, her gaze lost in the flames. "The child," he said, his voice low, not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact. "When is it due?" Lily started, her eyes, wide and luminous in the firelight, flying to his. Fear flickered there, raw and immediate, the fear of judgment, of further abandonment. She clutched her belly tighter, a small, protective gesture that tore at something within him. Her lips trembled, but no words came. Tears welled, silver tracks on her pale cheeks. He put down the axe and the stone, his movement slow, deliberate. He knelt before her, an uncharacteristically humble posture for the stoic lumberjack. "I will not harm you, Lily," he said, his voice softer now, imbued with a rough gentleness. Nor the babe. Her shoulders sagged with a relief so profound it was almost a collapse. A single sob escaped her, then another. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hesitantly covering hers where they rested on her swollen belly. He felt the faint, fluttery movement beneath, a new life, a tiny, insistent pulse in the vast silence of their world. In that moment, the future he had long ago relinquished, the prayer he had thought unanswered, flickered before him, fragile and impossibly real. Lily's silence, born of trauma and fear, began to yield, not in a torrent of words, but in hesitant trickles, like a frozen stream finally breaking free. She told him, in fragmented sentences interspersed with long pauses and the language of her expressive eyes, of a cruel father, a weary mother, of a fleeting, regretted encounter that had left her with this growing life, a mark of shame in their small, judgmental community. She had been cast out not for barrenness, as some cruel whispers at Coulter's Dell might have suggested to any who inquired after her, but for a fertility that was, to her family, a damning inconvenience. Elias listened, his face grim, his heart aching for the desolation she must have endured. He saw not a fallen woman, but a survivor, a vessel of unexpected life. His own past, his longing for a child with Sarah, a dream shattered by nature's decree, lent a poignant weight to Lily's presence. Her pregnancy, far from being a burden to him, felt like a fragile, sacred trust. He found himself watching over her with a fierce, tender protectiveness. He took on more of the chores, ensuring she rested, that she ate the choicest morsels from their limited stores. He even attempted a clumsy sort of nesting, repairing a rickety cradle he'd found stored in the small loft, a relic from a past he seldom revisited, perhaps one his own father had made. Lily watched him, a soft wonder dawning in her eyes. The cabin, once a mere shelter, began to feel like a haven, a sanctuary against the harshness of the world and the approaching climax of her pregnancy. The external world, however, had a long memory. One blustery afternoon, a grizzled trapper, Jedediah, a rare visitor to Elias's remote domain, stopped by, seeking shelter from an early spring squall. Over a mug of hot, weak tea, he shared news from the settlements. "Heard tell some folk downriver were asking about a young woman," Jedediah said, his eyes shrewd as he glanced at Lily, who had retreated to the shadows by the hearth. "Dark hair, quiet-like. Matched her description, near enough. Sounded like her pa, looking to bring her back, or maybe settle a score with whoever took her in." Elias's hand tightened around his mug. "They won't find her here," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of inflection, yet carrying an unmistakable warning. Jedediah, wise in the ways of mountain men and their reticence, merely grunted and changed the subject. But the seed of unease was planted. The cruel world Lily had fled still had tendrils, and they might yet reach into their secluded peace. The approaching birth was not their only impending challenge. The late spring storm arrived with the fury of a betrayed god, a screaming white maelstrom that erased the landscape, transforming the familiar contours of the mountains into a shifting, treacherous wilderness. It struck without warning, one moment the air crisp with the promise of melt, the next a howling vortex of ice and wind. Inside the cabin, the fire roared in the hearth, a defiant orange heart against the storm siege. Lily, her time near, had grown restless, her breath shallow, her hands often pressed to her lower back. Elias watched her, his own anxiety a tight knot in his chest. He had faced down blizzards, bears, the constant threat of injury in his dangerous profession, but this intimate, elemental struggle of life emerging, filled him with a profound and terrifying awe. As the storm reached its zenith, the wind shrieking like 1,000 tortured souls, Lily cried out, a sharp, indrawn gasp that cut through the tempest's roar. Her eyes met Elias's, wide with a mixture of pain and fear. "It's time," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gale. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Elias. He was a lumberjack, a man of axe and saw, not a midwife. Sarah had known of these things, her mother had taught her, but Sarah was dust, and he was alone with this fragile girl and the immense, terrifying power of birth. He pushed the fear down, his protective instincts, honed by years of solitary survival, surging to the fore. He helped her to the pallet near the fire, his hands, usually so sure with an axe handle, trembling slightly as he tried to make her comfortable. He remembered fragments, tales told by old women, things he'd overheard. Hot water. Clean cloths. Courage. The storm hammered at the cabin, the timbers groaning, snow piling in ghostly drifts against the small window. It was as if the wild, untamed heart of the wilderness was trying to break in, to reclaim them. Hours passed in a blur of escalating pain for Lily, and desperate, clumsy ministrations from Elias. He wiped her brow, spoke words of encouragement he wasn't sure he believed himself, his voice a low rumble against her cries. He held her hand, her small fingers gripping his with surprising strength, a lifeline in the overwhelming tide. The cabin became a crucible, the air thick with effort, with fear, with the raw, primal energy of creation. The night wore on, an eternity compressed into hours of desperate struggle. Lily's strength ebbed and flowed like the storm outside, each wave of pain threatening to pull her under. Elias, his face etched with exhaustion and fierce concentration, stayed by her side, a steadfast anchor in the chaos. He willed his own strength into her, murmuring reassurances, his touch surprisingly gentle on her fevered skin. There were moments when fear threatened to engulf him entirely, when Lily's cries weakened to whimpers, when her pallor became alarming. He thought of Sarah, of the crushing finality of loss, and a desperate resolve hardened within him. He would not lose Lily. He would not lose this child. He fought against the encroaching darkness with every fiber of his being, drawing on reserves of resilience he hadn't known he possessed. He remembered a story his own mother used to tell, of a difficult birth in a harsh winter, of a special tea made from herbs that eased the passage. He had no such herbs, only his unwavering presence and a love he hadn't yet dared to name. As dawn approached, painting the small, snow-caked window with a faint, grey light, the storm outside began to relent, its fury slowly abating. And then, in the relative quiet, punctuated only by Lily's ragged breaths and the dying moan of the wind, a new sound emerged, a thin, wavering cry, impossibly fragile, yet piercingly alive. A baby. A life wrested from the teeth of the storm. Elias, his senses reeling, saw the tiny, red-faced infant, slick and struggling, in Lily's trembling arms. He reached out a hesitant finger, touching the baby's minuscule hand, and felt a jolt, a connection so profound it stole his breath. Lily, pale and utterly spent, looked up at him, her eyes luminous with exhaustion and a dawning, incredulous joy. A tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Elias looked from the mother to the child, a daughter, he saw, and back to Lily. The stark cabin, moments before a place of agonizing struggle, was suddenly filled with an almost unbearable tenderness. He cleared his throat, his voice thick with unshed emotion. A girl, he managed, the words rough, yet carrying the weight of a miracle witnessed. A strong girl. Lily offered a weak, radiant smile, her first true smile he had ever seen, and it was like the sun breaking through after the longest, darkest night. The unspoken commitment, forged in shared fear and desperate hope, settled around them, as tangible as the scent of wood smoke and new life. In the days that followed, the cabin transformed. The raw terror of the birth gave way to a quiet rhythm of care and wonder. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside hushed and pristine under a blanket of fresh snow, the sunlight dazzling on its surface. Inside, a new, gentle energy pulsed. Elias, usually so adept in the wild, found himself endearingly clumsy in the presence of the infant. He'd fashioned a tiny cradle from a hollowed log, lining it with the softest scraps of fur he possessed. He would sit by it for long stretches, watching the baby sleep, his calloused finger often captured by her surprisingly strong grip. He learned to change swaddling, to soothe her fretful cries with a low, rumbling hum that seemed to mimic the forest's ancient lullabies. Lily, the weak, recovered slowly, her gaze seldom leaving her daughter. She named her Hope. Hope, for the future Elias had unknowingly offered her, for the life that had blossomed against all odds. Watching Elias with the baby, his large, rough hands so tender, his stoic face softened by an unfamiliar awe, Lily felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long began to recede, replaced by a tentative, burgeoning trust, and something akin to love. One afternoon, as Elias held Hope, rocking her gently, Lily reached out and laid her hand over his on the baby's tiny back. Her touch was light, yet it sent a current through him. "Thank you, Elias," she whispered, her voice clear and soft, no longer the hesitant murmur of before. For everything he met her gaze, and in the quiet depths of her eyes, he saw not the broken outcast he had first encountered, but a woman of immense strength and gentle spirit, a mother, his partner in this unexpected journey. He simply nodded, his throat too tight for words, but his heart, long dormant, swelled with a profound and healing gratitude. The small, carved wooden bird he had whittled during the long nights of her recovery, a clumsy but heartfelt offering, sat on the mantelpiece, a symbol of the fragile, precious new life, and the family that had taken root in the unlikeliest of soils. The cabin was no longer just his solitary refuge, it was their shared home, filled with the quiet miracle of their interconnected lives. The world outside their mountain sanctuary eventually intruded, not with the fury of a storm, but with the determined footsteps of the past. Weeks had turned into months, Hope was thriving, a gurgling, bright-eyed infant, and Lily's quiet presence had become as essential to Elias as the air he breathed. Spring had truly arrived, painting the mountainsides with tender green and the fleeting colors of wildflowers. One sun-dappled morning, as Elias was splitting firewood, a sharp bark from the stray dog that had adopted them some weeks prior alerted him. He looked up to see two figures emerging from the tree line, making their way towards the cabin. His blood ran cold. He recognized the florid face and belligerent stance of Lily's father, and beside him, a younger, harder-faced man Elias didn't know, but whose predatory gaze swept over the cabin with an air of ownership. Lily, who had been tending a small patch of herbs near the door with Hope bundled close, froze, her face paling. Elias dropped his axe and moved to stand before her and the child, his body a solid, unyielding shield. "What do you want?" Elias's voice was low, dangerous as a rumbling avalanche. Lily's father, Abner, sneered. "Come for what's mine." The girl. "And what she owes," he gestured towards Lily. The younger man smirked, his eyes lingering on Lily in a way that made Elias's hands clench into fists. "She was promised to me," the stranger said. A debt her father incurred. Lily shrank behind Elias, clutching Hope tighter. But then, a flicker of the strength she had found in motherhood, in the safety of Elias's care, ignited within her. She stepped partially out from behind him. "I am not yours to trade," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "My place is here," Abner scoffed. "With this mountain hermit? Living like savages? You'll come back, girl. You have a duty." Elias took a step forward, his shadow falling over them. He was not a man of many words, but his presence, his quiet intensity, spoke volumes. "She stays," he stated, each word a stone dropped into a deep well. "This is her home. Hope is her child. They are my family." Or the word family hung in the air, potent and irrefutable. Abner and the stranger looked at Elias, truly looked at him then, at the unwavering resolve in his eyes, the raw protective power emanating from him. They saw not just a lone lumberjack, but a man defending his own. The younger man's smirk faltered. Abner's bluster seemed to deflate. They had come expecting a frightened girl and perhaps a reluctant guardian, not this granite wall of quiet fury. After a long, tense moment, Abner spat on the ground. "She's cursed, you fool. You'll see." But there was no conviction in his voice. They turned, and without another word, retreated back into the forest, their cruel world defeated not by violence, but by the unshakable strength of a love they could not comprehend. Elias watched them go, then turned to Lily, his gaze gentle. She met his eyes, a tremulous smile on her lips, tears of relief and gratitude shining. He reached out, his hand finding hers, their fingers lacing together, a silent vow renewed in the mountain sunshine. Years unspooled like thread from a spindle, each season weaving its pattern into the tapestry of their lives. The cabin on the high peak, once a monument to solitude, now resonated with the warmth of a family. Hope, no longer a babe in arms, was a bright, curious child of 5 summers, her laughter echoing through the pines like wind chimes, her dark hair, so like her mother's, flying as she chased butterflies in the small meadow Elias had cleared. Lily's touch was everywhere, in the cheerful curtains at the window, sewn from scraps of traded calico, in the small, thriving garden that yielded vegetables and herbs, a vibrant splash of color against the cabin's weathered timbers, in the gentle order and quiet contentment that filled their home. Her intuitive connection to the land seemed to make everything around her flourish, a quiet magic that Elias marveled at daily. He was no longer the grief-hollowed man of years past. The lines on his face were still etched by sun and wind, but now they were softened by smiles, by the easy peace of a man who had found his purpose. His love for Lily was a deep, steady current beneath the surface of their days, expressed not in grand pronouncements, but in the way he watched her move about the cabin, the way his hand always found hers in the quiet evenings by the fire, the way he taught Hope to identify bird calls and track deer. He still felled timber, but now he returned not to an empty cabin, but to the embrace of his family. One evening, as the sun bled crimson and gold behind the western peaks, they sat on the rough-hewn porch he had added. Hope was asleep inside, clutching a small, smoothly carved wooden bear, a successor to the bird he had made when she was born. Lily leaned her head against Elias's shoulder, her hand resting on his. "Do you ever miss the silence?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the scent of wood smoke and contentment. Elias looked out at the vast, darkening expanse of the mountains, the same peaks that had once mirrored his loneliness. He thought of the long, empty years, the ache of Sarah's loss, the despair that had nearly consumed him. Then he looked at Lily, at the gentle curve of her smile in the twilight, and felt the steady beat of Hope's quiet breathing from within the cabin. The silence he had once known was a barren thing. This quiet, shared with them, was full of life, of love, of a peace that ran deeper than any he had ever imagined. "No," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This quiet is better." He had prayed for life, for a reason, and the answer had come not in a thunderclap, but in the hesitant footsteps of an abandoned girl, in the miraculous cry of a newborn child, in the steady, unwavering growth of a love that had healed them all. Their story became a quiet legend in the hidden folds of the mountains, a testament whispered on the wind, carried by the murmuring streams. It spoke of a love born in desolation, nurtured by courage, and solidified by the unbreakable bonds of chosen family. Elias, the stoic lumberjack, had found his heart rekindled by the resilient outcast, Lily, and together they had cultivated a life where once only sorrow had grown. The miracle she carried was not just the child, Hope, who blossomed under their care, but the miracle of healing, of second chances, of love's tenacious power to transform even the most barren landscapes of the soul. Their legacy was not one of grand deeds or worldly riches, but of quiet strength, enduring tenderness, and the profound truth that sometimes, the greatest treasures are found not in what is sought, but in what is unexpectedly given and bravely received. The cabin stood as a beacon, a small, warm light in the vast wilderness, a symbol of hope fulfilled. Their journey reminds us that even in the deepest solitude, connection can find a way, that even the most broken hearts can learn to beat again in rhythm with another's. It teaches that the prayers whispered in despair can be answered in the most unforeseen ways, often through the simple, courageous act of offering shelter, of seeing worth where others see none, of opening one's heart to the unexpected arrival of grace. If the tale of Elias, Lily, and Hope, their quiet courage and the unexpected miracle of their love, has resonated within you, if it has touched a place in your heart that understands the language of resilience and the quiet power of selfless kindness, then please, let their light shine further. Share this story with those who might find solace or inspiration in its telling. Like this reflection of human strength, subscribe for more whispers of hope from the quiet corners of life, and perhaps, share in the comments below what unexpected miracles have blossomed in the wild gardens of your own experience. For in every act of compassion, in every moment of shared vulnerability, lies the potential for a miracle all our own, a testament to the enduring human spirit.